Quédate. All right. Good to be back with you. I think I'm over my sickness, but I'll probably purposefully stay a little socially distant today. Maybe just some fist bumps. But I think we should be able to get through the class today and the sermon this morning. And so, uh, if you would, let's continue on with our study of verbs, and we're in non-indicative. So when we're talking about indicative verbs, we're talking about the realm of reality. So when we are non-indicative, we are outside of reality. And what we introduced were the subjunctive, the optative briefly, and the imperative. We're going to talk a little bit about infinitives and participles in Greek, and we're going to see that there's quite a bit of parallel between English infinitives and participles and the Greek counterparts. But as we move into infinitives, in English, what is an infinitive? Yeah, to go. And so it could be used as a noun. It could also be as kind of a compliment. I am getting ready to go. And so you have these kind of parallels in Greek as well. Notice that the word infinitive, what does that sound like? Infinity. So it's not finite. It's not that it's grounded. It is kind of up here, if you will, in the realm of the thought and not so much the actual person action. For instance, you have to be versus he was. It is much more concrete whenever you say he was, because you have a person, you have a time, you have an aspect, but just to be, well, that's just, you're supposed to only think about the verb itself. You're not necessarily thinking about a specific person or a specific time. It is infinite in that sense. And so that's why it's called an infinitive. And in Greek, what we're going to find is that it can either modify another verb or it can function as a noun. And the phrase you want to connect with infinitive is verbal noun. As Tony pointed out, to be or not to be, that is the question. What you're doing there is you are saying to be is the question. And so you're treating it like a noun. To be equals the question. To be, that is the question. So when we talk about infinitives in Greek, is if they modify a verb, the infinitive can express purpose or result. For instance, he wants to be baptized to be forgiven of his sins. Do you see how both of those kind of convey a little bit of purpose? Is what he wants is to be baptized. That's actually somewhat complementary. But to be forgiven shows this is his intention with the baptism. And so we'll see that kind of idea. We also see that it could express actual result, or it can complete the idea of another verb, and that's that complementary idea. Let's see each of these actually in the Bible. In Matthew 5:17, could someone read that for us in English? Matthew 5:17.
Do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them.
All right, so we have some infinitives here. Take a guess. Which ones are our infinitives? To abolish. Now, pet peeve of mine, I don't like the New American Standard there. Is that what you're using? ESV maybe says the same thing. ESV. I think that's somewhat confusing. I think better to destroy of the New King James would be the best translation there, but that's a completely different discussion. But notice he says, I did not come to destroy or to abolish. Notice he's saying this is kind of a negative purpose. This is not the reason I came. This is not the purpose for why I came. I did not come to destroy. But why did he come? To fulfill. Those are infinitives. Notice you have a verb, I came not to destroy, but to fulfill. And so both of those indicate purpose. One, he's negating, he says this is not the purpose, but then the other, he is affirming this is the purpose. And we do the same thing in English. That's why we translate it, I did not come to destroy, I came to fulfill. That's how they use infinitives, we use it in the same way. All right, let's look at Romans chapter 1 and verse 20. Romans 1:20, who wants to read that for us?
For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse.
All right. Does anybody have their interlinear open? Or can get it? Where do you see an infinitive there in verse number 20? Yes, R would be the abbreviation. Or, sorry, no, where is that? Yeah. The parsing is what I'm looking for there. Yes. So we have, now I'm trying to find it on my own here. Yes. Yes. So notice here that we have his eternal power and Godhead, preposition, is, o, to, ine. So ine is the infinitive form of imi. Now, how do we translate that in English? So that they are without excuse. Now, notice there, are is actually the infinitive. If we were to translate this straight literal, it would be so that to be, with reference to them, unexcused. Now, does that sound like good English? No. But what we can do is we can kind of make the infinitive into a finite verb in English to express the idea. What it's saying is that here's the actual result of him expressing himself to the world is they are without excuse. Some could argue that this is purpose, but I think it's probably a result. They are without excuse. To be without excuse, but it's showing actual result. Um, Here's where you actually need an interlinear because it doesn't translate exactly the same as we would an infinitive. Um, with the result that to be without excuse is getting there, but that's even not very good English. So I'm just pointing out that in Greek, what they can do is not only express purpose, which we would just translate the same as we would in infinitive, to be, you might have to have some kind of phrase like, with the result that they are without excuse. And the are there is the infinitive, and not, even though it's translated as a finite verb. All right, and then Matthew 6:24. Who has that? Yes, thank you.
No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth.
All right. Any guess where an infinitive is there? Yeah, there we go. If we were to translate this a little differently, we might be able to see the infinitive. No one is able to serve. To serve there, notice that it's not necessarily on its own. It is completing the idea of to be able. So if I were to say, you are able, what do you say next? To do what? You're looking for an infinitive. To do what? And so in Greek here, they do the same thing. If you have to be able, there's some other words that are connected directly to infinitives, but to be able is probably the most common. No one is able to do what? To serve two masters. And so the to serve there is the infinitive, but it's completing the idea of the verb. And so there's our three main ideas of infinitives usually express purpose if they're connected to a verb, or result if they're connected to a verb, or they are just completing the idea of a verb. Does that kind of make sense? There's some parallel there to English, some differences with the result, but idea. But any thoughts about that?
But they don't, that's included in the word can, right?
So the verb is no one can, or can is the verb, and then serve is the infinitive, is how they're translating it.
Can serve or is able to serve.
Yeah. So it's a fine translation to say no one can serve, but you don't necessarily see as easily that serve is an infinitive. I think technically it'd still be an infinitive in English just without the to serve, just because of the construction, can serve. But when you translate the verb as no one is able, then you can really see the parallel of to serve because you have that to do whatever idea. Any additional thoughts on that?
Not necessarily the topic at hand, but just the way that it allows for emphasizing certain things of the order. You cannot God serve and well. I imagine he's putting God where it is in order to put the emphasis on it. This has to be your priority.
Exactly.
Something has to take second place.
Mm-hmm. So in translation, that kind of thing makes it difficult for us. But then whenever you're just looking at the interlinear, you can see where as if you're not looking at your interlinear right now, what Jesus does is he pulls the word God forward in the sentence, which probably shows emphasis that he says, no one, God, is able to serve, is maybe a way you could kind of reframe it in English to show the emphasis. Um, but yeah, they can rearrange because of the endings and such, rearrange the order, sometimes for emphasis. Good observation. Any other thoughts? All right, so it can be connected to a verb, but an infinitive can also function as a noun. Remember, it's a verbal noun. So sometimes it can have verbal characteristics, sometimes it can have lean toward noun characteristics, and an infinitive acts as a subject in a sentence. So for instance, we can keep going back to be or not to be. That's functioning as a noun in the sentence, but let's look at a biblical example, Philippians 1:21. And who wants to read that for us or quote it if you have it memorized?
For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain.
All right, what's the main part of that sentence? To live is Christ. There's your complete thought. It's to live is Christ. Now, we've seen some sentences like this where you say, He is God. Which one is your subject? Which one is the subject? He is the subject. What is this? Verb, which acts as an equal sign. What is this? Oh, there we go. We got our predicate. So we have our subject, our predicate. Here's our equal sign. We have an equal construction. So this is a predicate. This is what the subject is. What is our subject? To live. So instead of he is God or Christ, we could even make it more parallel. This verbal noun is functioning as the subject of the sentence. He's saying, the concept of living for me equals Christ. That's kind of how you could expand that out a little bit, is he wants you to think, not I live in Christ, or Christ lives in me, as he might say in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, but he says, just this whole concept of living as it refers to me, because he says, for me, he says, to live is Christ. And so this whole concept of living is, for Paul, is bound up in this concept of Christ as the realm.
But it still shows it as being a verb in the interlinear, right?
It'll say verb, and then it'll say present, infinitive. So the infinitive part, because an infinitive is a verbal idea. It's connected to verbs, but
But what I'm saying is that it's the same. It says infinitive in both examples we looked at too. So.
right. So that's where what you have to do is, as you're looking at the sentence, you have to decide, is this connected? Well, let's take an example. If we have Matthew 5:17 again, it said, I did not come. Then we have our infinitive. Notice you have a complete thought even before you add the infinitive. If I were to just say, is Christ, is that a complete thought? No, so if I have a subject, I have a verb, this has a negation. So subject, verb, and then let's think of this almost as an object. You have a complete thought apart from the infinitive. If you don't have a complete thought, if it is part of the main sentence, then it's functioning as a noun rather than connecting somehow to your verb. So it'll be labeled the same as infinitive. You have to look at the sentence and figure out. Yeah, an infinitive will always be a verb. In the interlinear, any infinitive will be connected somehow to a verbal idea because it is a verbal noun. What you have to figure out is it acting more like a verb as it is here, or is it acting more like a noun as it is here?
So the same one, the to die, how does that get characterized? Because it's in the verb and or it's infinitive.
So to live is Christ and to die is gain. Yes, you have this.
Same idea.
Yep, to die is gain. So here's your predicate again. This is functioning as the subject. To die. To die. Yeah, thank you. To die is gain. And it's in English, we would call an infinitive a verb of sorts as well. We're just saying this verb is functioning as a noun, and they do the same thing in Greek. It's a verbal idea. And really, again, verb is just the concept of a action rather than a thing, but you're taking this action and you're almost making it into a concept, a thing, an idea. And so it's functioning as a noun in that sense. Do you have something, Trevor?
I have a question. So it seems like the next step would be is, okay, once you identify that this is actually functioning as a noun, can you apply the labels of like nominative and whatnot? And is there an interlinear that goes that next step that tells you what function it's playing as a noun?
I don't think your interlinear will act that way. Yeah, because an infinitive is, again, it's infinite. It's not bound in that sense, and so now infinitives are going to be more. I mean, they're common, but they're not as common as other verbal ideas. And so in that sense, I'm giving you the terminology so that when you see infinitive, you know how it can function. But it's not that you're going to come across one of these infinitives acting as a subject of the sentence every page of your interlinear or something like that. It's just it can function this way. And you have to be aware that when you come to it, it's not that you should, if you see an infinitive, just always try first to translate it to live. And if that fits, use it. And then only change from that when you need to.
It is interesting that to live is present and to die is aorist.
Yeah. There may be some significance because when you're outside the indicative, you have that aspect that he's saying, this whole act of living is Christ, but even the looking at the action as a whole, death, that's still the same. And so he's kind of wanting you to view it through the lens of ongoing action versus holistic type action, which is beyond the scope of what we're trying to do. Just giving an example, but it'd be something to think about. Any other thoughts there? All right. We won't look at Mark 9:5, but you have, again, it functioning as a noun. All right, any questions about infinitives? So what two-word phrase should you be thinking about when you see the word infinitive? Verbal noun. That's what I want you to think, verbal noun. And you're probably going to try translating it as to plus the way you would normally translate the verb. So to, be, to, live, to, gain. Any verb, you put the to on the front and you take it out of he lived, he lives, she lives. You're just saying this concept of living. All right, so participles. Now, I don't want you to get overwhelmed as we talk about participles but I do want you to recognize the gravity of participles. When I first seriously learned Greek, I learned from the updated edition of Machen. And here's what he says before he introduces participles. The importance of this lesson on participles can hardly be overestimated. Without understanding thoroughly the use of participles, it is impossible to master the later lessons and to read the Greek New Testament. The participle is quite the crucial matter in the study of Greek. So Machen knew quite a bit about participles, and he said, about Greek in general, and he said, you can't get Greek unless you understand participles. And that is true. Participles are all over the place in Greek. There is some parallel to English, but then there's some distinctions, and you have to start thinking how they thought in order to really get what they're doing. Now, here's something to think about with participles. Rarely are they the main thought of a sentence. So what you're going to be looking for is, what's my subject, what's my verb, and if there is possible, an object. Get that part of the sentence. That's the simple part, where you have your nominative, you have your verb, and then maybe you have your accusative. That's the most simple sentence you could probably come up with in Greek in general. Participles add additional information most of the time. So they're going to give you additional information about the subject. They're going to give you additional information about the object. They're going to give you additional information about the circumstances. There's a variety of ways that they're used, but we have to get a handle on the terminology and the use so that when we come in our interlinear to a participle, we know here's what it could be. Now, what I'm going to do probably next time, or maybe I'll email it to you, is give you a flow chart of how participles can be used, and it actually says, does it function this way? Yes or no? And then you go to the next part of your flow chart. And that makes things a little bit easier. I may email that to you soon, or I may try to get through a little bit more on participles before, because it can look a little overwhelming at first, but once you get some of the terminology, then the flow chart makes more sense. But let's talk a little bit about participles. Notice that in English, most of the time, it's an ing word. Sometimes it could be kind of a perfect, where you have like established could also be a participle, something along those lines, but we'll get to that as we go through. Mainly it's ing, so you want to think ing with participles, running, hitting, jumping, those kinds of words. In Greek, a participle can function adverbially, attributively, substantively. Now, I'm going to try to get those words in your head, but let me slow down and explain what I mean by each of those. What do you guess adverbial participles do? What's an adverb do? Modifies a verb, that's it. A verbial participle is going to modify the verb in some way. What do you think about an attributive participle?
Like attributing something to some person.
Very good. And it's going to, attributive is often going to almost function as an adjective, that it's going to be modifying a noun of some kind. What do you think a substantive participle is? Or a substantive participle? Yeah. Both of those put together. It's actually acting as kind of a noun. It's a substantive. It is taking this verbal idea. So, well, we'll get to that in just a second. So you have it can modify a verb. It can almost act as an adjective, attributive, or it can act as a noun. And we'll see examples as we go through. So for instance, we have an adverbial participle here in Matthew 1:24. You can look it up in your interlinear, or just follow along with me here as I go through a couple things. I'll get a laser pointer up here. So this is our participle, the red highlighted word. And this is the word for arise, to arise. And basically, it's having arisen, having arisen, but the Joseph from the sleep, this is where we get our word hypnosis, from sleep, he did as he was instructed, commanded. It was commanded to him, the angel of the Lord commanded him. So notice you could make it into an ing word, but because you don't need to know this just by looking at it, but it's a aorist participle, and an aorist participle doesn't have time. Remember, we're not in the indicative, but it usually talks about action that happens before the verb, and present is at the time of the verb. So this having arisen. Notice how we put that in English to show that this was before he did it, but after he arose, he did as the angel taught him. So notice there that it's giving you some of the circumstances. It's giving you the action that happened before. It's modifying the verb. The verb is he did as the angel of the Lord instructed him. He did. But when did he do that? Circumstances. After he arose. So it's giving you kind of the time of the action, what happened surrounding the action of him doing this. That's adverbial. It's modifying the verb. Now, looking down here at attributive, we said that it's basically kind of giving you more information about the noun or the substantive of the sentence. So again, read is our participle. And I'll show you how to look at this in your interlinear. I just want to show the examples. Therefore, every tree, dendron, not making, bearing fruit, good fruit, is cut down and into the fire is thrown. So notice here, it's every tree. Well, what tree? Those trees that are not bearing fruit. So it's giving you more information about the noun, the tree not bearing fruit. We're going to see how translators kind of play around with this because most translations will not say, for this first example, having arisen. They'll say something like after he arose. Most of them will not say every tree not bearing. They will say every tree that does not bear. But they're giving you the sense, and this is how participles are often used. They're either modifying the verb, telling you the circumstances of when the verb happens, or other things besides just when, and then also giving you more information about the noun in the sentence. All right? Now let's go to substantive participles. It's basically acting as a noun. So, for instance, Matthew 7, verse 8, for God, every the asking, every the asking receives, and the seeking finds, and to the knocking it is opened. Does that make much sense in English? No, so we play around with it a little bit. We say, since this is a singular masculine, every one or every man who asks. Notice it's the asking. The asking one. Or man, if it's masculine, or feminine, if woman, if it's feminine. But it's literally just the asking. So in Greek, what they can do is they can take that participle, asking, they can put an article on the front and say, it's the asking, but it's not just the thought of asking, it's actually talking about a person who is asking. So how would we translate this in English? Probably not the asking one. We would say the one, then we add in, who asks. But notice how asking is acting as a noun. It's talking about a person. And a noun is a person, place, or thing. So it's the asking one, the one who asks. What does he get? He receives. Notice this participle is not connected to any noun. It's not like it has o eton anthropos, the asking man. They just leave out the noun. And they assume that you'll get it, that this is the asking one, the one who asks. So that's how they can use participles. We don't necessarily do that because we have to have something in there to show that it's a person, a place, or a thing. But they didn't have to. They could have just said the asking one, or the seeking one, or this is a dative actually, to the one who is knocking, it will be opened.
Does the article with it help us determine if it's
Yes. Almost every substantive participle will have an article. Not all, but almost everyone. That's part of the flow chart usually, is does it have an article? That's going to shoot you down to the substantive most of the time. Or actually, it will either give you, notice here, well, this is a bad example. um, if this had an article, the tree that does not bear fruit, if the noun has an article, an attributive will also have an article. So in your flow chart, it will say, does it have an article? Then it means it either has to be an attributive participle or a substantive participle. If it doesn't have a noun connected to it, it's a substantive participle. So that in the flow chart, it will actually carry you through some of the things surrounding it, so you can see that. We'll talk about that more. In fact, depending on how far we get in this class, I hope to spend a little bit more time on participles. This is just the overview. If an infinitive is a verbal noun, here's what the phrase I want you to get with the participle. Verbal adjective. And it's the reason we can call it a verbal adjective is because a lot of times it's modifying a noun or acting as a noun, just as you could have with an adjective. For instance, I've not seen the movie, but The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, good is not a noun. What is it? It's an adjective, but it's functioning as a noun. The good. Well, the good what? Well, it could be either singular, the good man, or it could be the good men, if it's plural. In Greek, it's explicit. You know exactly what it is. So an adjective can function that way. Thus, if participles are verbal adjectives, they are ing words that are modifying something in the sentence. You can call them a verbal adjective. They have an adverbial function, but even adjectives can kind of play into that as well. So what I want you to get mainly with participles is ing, verbal adjectives, and here's how they can function. They can either modify the verb, modify a noun, or act like a noun. Those are our three main functions of the participle. Any questions about that? Now,
Maybe I'm still in Joe mode where I was trying to be as fair as possible to all the words that those fellows were uttering given their limited knowledge. But you said we would never translate that, the asking. And yet I'm thinking the asking, receive, the seeking, find,
yeah.
To the knocking, the door is open. Now it's interesting to me that we probably wouldn't write that. You can say it that way, spoken word, and it's pretty clear. If you read that you're going to have to reread it about 5 times.
And another reason why translators don't do it that way is because in English, you are left with ambiguity, like the good, the bad, and the ugly. Is this singular or plural? And it doesn't translate that in Matthew 7, that is singular, the one who asks. So you get even, actually by adding words to the English text, you get greater clarity of what actually underlies in Greek. And so we probably, even if we could say the asking, we would want to know if it's singular or plural, and so you have to add in something to give that information. So that's why no translator would translate it that way, at least in the New Testament. Yes.
Hebrews 10:25 has a lot of ing words in it.
Yeah.
Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another so much the more as you see today, approaching. 4 ing words. 3 of those are participles, and 1 is not.
Right.
So that really threw me off. That not forsaking participle. The assembling, well, that's a noun. That's not a participle. So you can't really tell if it's an ing word that it's going to be a participle.
Exactly. You would have to. English has some ambiguity where we have nouns that end in ing. I'm just saying in general, participles usually end in ing. They don't always, even in English, but just in general, ing words are most of the time participles. But again, that's even there in Hebrews. It's an English thing rather than a Greek thing necessarily, because you read your interlinear and you're going to see exactly which ones are participles and which ones are nouns.
Well, look it up in other translations, and it will say to assemble. Well, it's not an infinitive either. So
Yeah. That translators, and it also depends on the philosophy of the translation. Are they trying to give the sense? Are they trying to give closer to word order and kind of word for word translation? There's a lot of play that goes into it. I'm not saying that all translation is only interpretation, but there's a lot of interpretation that goes into translation. I think we can begin to appreciate that as we start looking at our interlinears and just seeing what they are having to, or what they're trying to accomplish with all that. So, now, I only want you to think of those three main concepts with participles: adverbial, attributive, or substantive. What you would find if you continue in your Greek is that there are nuances in Greek that we can apply different labels to them in English. For instance, when I say, I plan to preach on what the Bible says about children in a few moments, Lord willing. That's a participle, at least the willing part. This is acting as the subject of the participle. What do I mean by that? If. We automatically understand that when we use that participle, we are using it in, I think, what would be called a concessive way. They're saying, if this happens, if the Lord wills, Lord willing, in Greek, they can just throw in a participle without an article on the front of it, if it's being one of those adverbial participles. And they could mean if the Lord wills, just by saying Lord willing, just like we do. So that's getting into second, third year Greek, but there are other specific uses. If you really want to dig in, you could translate every time you come to a participle just Lord willing. But you may say, what does the author actually mean by that? And what he means is, if the Lord wills. And so those are some things you can think about. And that's why when you get to some translations, you'll see things like Hebrews 1:1, God, literally, having spoken to the fathers by the prophets. It's a participle. How do some translations translate it? Some translate it, God, after he had spoken. Notice they're giving it a temporal idea, that after this had happened. Some of them would say this is, I guess it would be concessive there, of although he spoke to the fathers, in these last days he has spoken. Notice that they are doing a little interpretation with those participles. Why? Because the participles are used that way sometimes, and they're trying to bring out in English how they're being used at that time. All right, so we'll finish up some odds and ends next time. We need to talk, since we're talking about verbs, we need to talk a little bit about the middle voice, because I introduced it several weeks ago and said that it's somewhat unique. We'll talk a little bit about the middle voice, and then we'll move on from there. We are a couple of class periods away from taking some of this terminology we've been learning, and you're going to get, I haven't been giving a lot of assignments, you're going to get an assignment. I'm going to try to teach how to use this in doing a word study, and then I want you all to do a word study. So we're going to do that in a couple of weeks once we get through all that. Thanks, everybody.